The fatal mistake that cost thousands of lives. December 1941. The temperature on the Eastern Front dropped to -45 degrees Celsius. German soldiers froze to death in their trenches. Weapons jammed solid. Tanks refused to start. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered France in 6 weeks, was literally paralyzed by the Russian winter. General Eduard Wagner, Quartermaster General of the German Army, reported on December 27, 1941, that frostbite cases exceeded combat casualties. Over 100,000 German soldiers suffered severe frostbite in the first winter alone. Thousands had limbs amputated. The mighty German war machine discovered what Napoleon had learned 129 years earlier. Winter kills faster than bullets. But while the Germans froze, and while American troops would later struggle desperately in the Ardennes winter of 1944, two nations had soldiers who moved through blizzards like they were born in them. Canada and Britain developed winter warfare capabilities that turned what destroyed other armies into a tactical advantage. The question that haunted military planners wasn't whether cold weather was dangerous. It was how the Canadians and British made it look easy. This is the real story of how geography, necessity, and hard-earned knowledge created the most effective winter soldiers of World War II. No other Allied forces came close to their cold weather effectiveness. By 1945, when other nations were still learning basic snow survival, Canadian and British ski troops were conducting mountain warfare operations that seemed impossible to everyone else. The Canadian Foundation, where winter was simply life. The Canadian advantage didn't begin in 1939. It began centuries before, when the first Europeans arrived in a land where winter wasn't a season. It was a 6-month ordeal that killed the unprepared without mercy. By the 1930s, the average Canadian infantryman came from communities where -30 degrees Celsius was just Tuesday in February. Prairie farmers from Saskatchewan and Manitoba knew what happened when you touched metal with bare hands at -40. The skin stuck and tore away. Lumberjacks from Quebec and Ontario had generations of knowledge about moving through deep snow, building emergency shelters, and recognizing the early signs of frostbite. These weren't military skills taught in training camps. They were survival basics learned in childhood. When Canada declared war on Germany in September 1939, the military didn't need to create a winter warfare program from scratch. They needed to weaponize knowledge that already existed in the civilian population. The 1st Canadian Army began recruiting heavily from northern communities. Ski instructors from the Laurentian Mountains, trappers from the Yukon, indigenous guides who knew winter survival techniques perfected over millennia, all were integrated into specialized units. The Canadian training philosophy was radically different from other nations. Where the Germans treated winter as an obstacle to overcome, Canadians treated it as terrain to exploit. Training exercises in Petawawa, Ontario, and Shiloh, Manitoba, routinely continued in conditions that would have canceled operations in any other army. Troops learned to dig snow caves that provided better insulation than tents. They practiced skiing with full combat loads until it became as natural as walking. They discovered that properly prepared wool clothing, layered correctly, outperformed many synthetic alternatives being developed elsewhere. By 1942, the Canadian Army had established winter warfare schools that attracted observers from the United States and Britain. The curriculum covered everything from preventing weapons from freezing, requiring specific oils and constant maintenance, to the psychological challenges of operating in environments where a broken leg 30 miles from base meant death. Canadian doctrine emphasized that winter warfare wasn't about enduring the cold. It was about using the cold as a weapon. Troops learned to move silently on snowshoes, attack across frozen lakes that enemy forces assumed were impassable, and use blizzards as cover for advances that would be suicidal in clear weather. The results spoke for themselves. In Exercise Eskimo, conducted in February 1945 near Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, Canadian troops conducted a battalion-level attack in -40-degree weather with winds exceeding 50 kilometers per hour. The operation succeeded with 0 cold weather casualties. American observers called it the most impressive display of winter warfare capability they had ever witnessed. Britain's unlikely mastery, the Lovat Scouts and mountain warfare. Britain faced a paradox. The British Isles rarely saw extreme cold. London winters were mild, rainy affairs. Yet by 1943, Britain had developed elite mountain and winter warfare troops that matched or exceeded Canadian capabilities in specialized environments. How did a nation with relatively temperate weather produce soldiers who could operate in Arctic conditions? The answer lay in a unique Scottish regiment called the Lovat Scouts. Originally formed during the Second Boer War as scouts and snipers drawn from Highland gamekeepers and stalkers, the Lovat Scouts had something unusual: men who spent their lives in the Scottish Highlands, where conditions, while not as extreme as Canada, still demanded intimate knowledge of mountain terrain and cold weather survival. In 1941, as Britain watched Germany invade Norway and recognized the strategic importance of mountain warfare, the War Office made a crucial decision. They sent the Lovat Scouts to train in Canada. Not just anywhere in Canada, to Jasper, Alberta, in the heart of the Canadian Rockies, where winter conditions matched anything they might face in Norway or the Alps. The training that followed was extraordinary. British soldiers worked alongside Canadian ski troops and mountain guides from the Canadian Pacific Railway's resort operations. They learned techniques that had no equivalent in British military doctrine. How to navigate in whiteout conditions using terrain features invisible to untrained eyes. How to conduct long-range patrols on skis carrying enough supplies to survive a week without resupply. How to build snow shelters that could keep a man alive in conditions that would kill him in an hour without protection. The Lovat Scouts absorbed it all, but they added their own innovations. British military culture emphasized meticulous organization and detailed planning. They created comprehensive manuals on cold weather operations that became standard references. They developed specialized equipment, including improved bindings for military skis and better integration of weapon systems with winter clothing. Where Canadian troops relied heavily on practical knowledge passed down informally, the British systematized everything, making it teachable to recruits who had never seen snow before. In 1943, the Lovat Scouts formed the core of Britain's new Commando Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre. They trained other British units and Allied forces in winter warfare techniques. Their expertise proved crucial during operations in Italy's Apennine Mountains during the winter of 1944–45, where conditions were far harsher than planners had anticipated. British winter troops developed a reputation for being able to go anywhere, regardless of weather. During the Italian campaign, they conducted night patrols in blizzard conditions that German forces considered impossible. They climbed supposedly impassable cliffs to attack enemy positions from unexpected directions. In one operation in February 1945, Lovat Scouts guided an entire battalion through a mountain pass in zero visibility, arriving behind German lines completely undetected. The contrast with other armies, why they failed where Canada and Britain succeeded. The differences became brutally clear on multiple fronts. The German experience on the Eastern Front is well documented, but American struggles in winter conditions revealed how even well-equipped, modern armies could be devastated by cold they weren't prepared for. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American forces faced conditions that were mild compared to a Canadian or Russian winter, temperatures around -15 to -20 Celsius. Yet cold weather injuries devastated American units. The 99th Infantry Division reported that trench foot and frostbite casualties exceeded combat wounds in the first week of fighting. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated with cold weather injuries. Weapons froze. Vehicles wouldn't start. Artillery recoil mechanisms seized up. The problems weren't due to lack of courage or poor equipment quality. They stemmed from lack of knowledge. American troops didn't know that you never sweat in extreme cold. Moisture in clothing reduces insulation and leads to hypothermia. They didn't understand that you must eat constantly in cold weather because your body burns calories just maintaining temperature. They weren't taught that tight boots cut off circulation and cause frostbite, or that you rotate dry socks constantly, or that you never touch metal with bare skin. Canadian troops serving alongside Americans watched in horror as soldiers made basic mistakes. One Canadian sergeant reported seeing American GIs trying to warm frozen weapons over open fires, damaging the metal's temper and making them unsafe to fire. Others suffered frostbite because they wore too many layers, sweated during exertion, then froze when they stopped moving. The Soviet experience was different but equally revealing. Soviet forces had vast experience with winter warfare, but their approach was brute force. Yes, they could fight in winter, but at enormous cost. Soviet doctrine accepted massive frostbite casualties as inevitable. Units were expected to lose significant percentages of their strength to cold weather injuries as a matter of course. Canadian and British forces proved there was another way. During joint training exercises with American units in 1944, Canadian instructors showed that with proper preparation, winter casualties could be almost eliminated. The key was knowledge and discipline, not heroic endurance. A comparison of frostbite rates tells the story. During winter operations in Italy in early 1945, British winter-trained units reported frostbite rates below 2% of total strength. Untrained American units in similar conditions saw rates exceeding 15%. The difference was pure knowledge. British troops knew how to prevent cold injuries. American troops were learning through terrible experience. Even more striking was operational effectiveness. Canadian and British winter troops maintained full combat capability in conditions that reduced other forces to barely functional survival mode. In Exercise Polar Bear, conducted in Norway in 1945 after the German surrender, Canadian troops demonstrated the ability to conduct offensive operations in Arctic conditions. They moved faster on skis than vehicles could manage on snow-covered roads. They attacked enemy positions that observers had declared unreachable in winter. They proved that winter, properly understood, wasn't an obstacle. It was an advantage for those who knew how to use it. Specialized equipment and innovative tactics. The technical innovations developed by Canadian and British forces represented quantum leaps beyond what other armies achieved. This wasn't about having better factories or more money. It was about deep understanding of winter's unique challenges driving creative solutions. Canadian equipment development started with clothing. While the German military issued overcoats that looked impressive but provided inadequate insulation, and early American winter gear was heavy and restrictive, Canadians refined a layering system based on traditional northern clothing. The outer layer was windproof but breathable, preventing heat loss from wind while allowing moisture from sweat to escape. The insulation layer used wool, which retains warmth even when damp, unlike cotton that loses all insulating value when wet. The innermost layer was designed to wick moisture away from skin. This seems obvious now, but in 1941 it was revolutionary. Most armies still issued single-piece heavy coats that made soldiers sweat during exertion, then froze solid when they stopped moving. Canadian troops could adjust their insulation by adding or removing layers, maintaining optimal temperature regardless of activity level. The British contributed crucial innovations in mountaineering equipment adapted for military use. They developed ice axes specifically designed for combat, shorter and more robust than civilian models, able to serve as both climbing tools and weapons. Their crampons, the spiked metal frames attached to boots for walking on ice, featured quick-release mechanisms that let soldiers transition rapidly from climbing to combat. Weapons maintenance in extreme cold required completely rethinking lubricants and operating procedures. Standard gun oils turned to gel below -20°C, jamming weapons solid. Canadian armorers discovered that certain automotive oils maintained fluidity at extreme temperatures. British gunsmiths developed modified bolt mechanisms with looser tolerances that functioned reliably even with ice formation. Both nations trained troops to field strip and clean weapons multiple times daily in cold weather, not because weapons were dirty, but because ice constantly formed in mechanisms. Tactical innovations were equally important. Canadian forces pioneered the use of frozen lakes and rivers as highways for rapid movement. What seemed like obvious terrain to Canadians was revolutionary to commanders from temperate climates. A frozen lake wasn't an obstacle. It was a perfectly flat avenue of approach that bypassed defensive positions located to guard roads. Canadian ski troops learned to move across frozen water bodies at night, approaching enemy positions from directions they considered impossible. British mountain troops developed vertical warfare tactics that exploited terrain other armies considered impassable. In the Italian mountains, they pioneered night climbing attacks, scaling cliffs in darkness to achieve complete surprise. They discovered that with proper training, soldiers could climb at night nearly as effectively as in daylight, and night climbing meant arriving at the objective completely undetected. Both nations understood something that eluded other armies. In winter warfare, mobility was everything. German and American forces often became static in winter, hunkering down to survive. Canadian and British forces increased operational tempo, using weather that paralyzed their opponents as cover for aggressive action. They attacked during blizzards, moved at night in temperatures that kept enemies in their shelters, and turned winter's challenges into tactical advantages. Perhaps most importantly, both nations developed comprehensive cold weather injury prevention programs. Every soldier received detailed instruction on recognizing early frostbite symptoms, whitening skin, numbness, pain. The buddy system required soldiers to check each other's exposed skin constantly. Medical officers attached to winter units carried specialized equipment for treating cold injuries immediately, before they became severe. The result was armies that didn't just survive winter, they thrived in it. Legacy and lessons. How their knowledge shaped modern winter warfare. The Canadian and British winter warfare expertise developed during World War II didn't end in 1945. It became the foundation for modern cold-weather military operations worldwide, influencing doctrine, training, and equipment design for the next 80 years. In the immediate post-war period, both nations formalized their winter warfare knowledge into comprehensive training programs. Canada established the Combat Training Center at CFB Valcartier, Quebec, which became the world's premier winter warfare school. Nations from around the world sent troops there to learn techniques originally developed during the war. The Norwegian military, despite having their own extensive winter experience, sent observers to study Canadian methods. The U.S. Army essentially adopted Canadian winter warfare doctrine wholesale, creating mountain warfare training centers modeled directly on Canadian examples. Britain's contribution lived on through the Royal Marine Commandos, who absorbed the mountain and Arctic warfare expertise of the wartime Lovat Scouts. The Commandos established the Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre in 1947, which continues today as one of the world's most elite cold-weather combat units. Their training in Norway draws directly from World War II innovations, the same emphasis on mobility, the same understanding that winter is an advantage rather than obstacle, the same meticulous attention to preventing cold injuries. The technological legacy was equally significant. Modern military cold-weather clothing systems, used by everyone from American Special Forces to Chinese mountain troops, are refined versions of the Canadian layering system developed in 1942. The principle of wind-resistant outer layers, insulating middle layers, and moisture-wicking base layers is now universal, but it originated with Canadian adaptations of traditional northern clothing. Modern military ski equipment, crampon designs, and mountaineering gear all show clear lineage from British wartime innovations. The specialized ice axes and climbing equipment used by mountain infantry units worldwide are direct descendants of tools developed for the Lovat Scouts and British Commandos. Perhaps most importantly, the operational concepts pioneered by Canadian and British winter troops reshaped how modern militaries think about cold-weather warfare. The idea that winter increases mobility rather than decreasing it, for properly trained forces, is now fundamental doctrine in every advanced military. The concept of using extreme weather as cover for aggressive operations appears in field manuals from NATO to the Russian military. Cold weather injury prevention programs in modern militaries are directly traceable to wartime Canadian and British innovations. The buddy system, constant monitoring for frostbite symptoms, and immediate treatment protocols were all systematized by these forces during World War II. Today's drastically lower cold weather casualty rates result from knowledge these pioneers developed through trial, error, and Arctic-tested experience. The contrast with other nations' learning curves is striking. The United States military, despite enormous resources, essentially started from zero in winter warfare knowledge in 1941. By studying Canadian methods and eventually adopting their doctrine, American forces dramatically reduced their learning time. The lessons cost Canada and Britain years to develop through practical experience in the harshest environments. Other nations gained that knowledge in months by learning from their example. In the end, the Canadian and British success in winter warfare came down to a fundamental difference in perspective. Other armies saw winter as an enemy to be endured. Canadian and British forces saw it as terrain to be mastered. That shift in thinking from endurance to exploitation made all the difference. The Germans froze in Russia because they tried to fight winter. The Canadians and British succeeded because they learned to fight with winter on their side. Today, when elite forces train for cold weather operations, whether Navy SEALs in Alaska, British Royal Marines in Norway, or Canadian Special Forces in the Arctic, they're using techniques, equipment, and doctrine with roots in World War II. The knowledge hard-won by those wartime winter warriors continues to save lives and enable operations in conditions that still seem impossible to the unprepared. Winter hasn't gotten any less deadly. But because of what Canadian and British forces learned and shared, modern soldiers face it with knowledge that turns a killer into an ally.